Okay, slightly amended my title to suit the slide there. Okay, thanks very much, SGRP, for inviting me to talk on archiving. It's not everyone's favourite subject, and it's quite encouraging that you think it's worth adding to your 50th anniversary celebrations. I'm going to talk through where many of the things that we've been working on have got to, and then I'm going to try and relate all that to the discipline of pottery studies. But there aren't really very many pictures of pots, I'm afraid. And I don't think there's any of Roman pots. Not I don't have a lot of them. Okay, what do we mean by an archaeological archive? Let's start with basics, just in case. This is a definition produced by the EAC, the European Archaeological Concilium, which, for those of you who don't know, is a sort of council of national heritage bodies, and their working group for archaeological archives produced this standard and guide. If you haven't seen it, log on to the URL at the top there, and you can even download it in Icelandic if you want to. So our definition very firmly relates an archaeological archive to an archaeological project. It is the product of that and should not be confused necessarily with an archaeology collection in a museum, elements of which will be derived from other sources and not just archaeological projects. So an archive is a particular product, and it will become part of an archaeology collection on transfer to a museum store, but if that ever happens, but and at that point becomes part of a bigger collection and a larger entity, which informs the study of the museum's collecting area. And that's the crucial aspect to it, really, is that it adds to the sum of knowledge if the archive is properly compiled, collected and transferred. The background to where we are now, I suppose there are 4 elements to that. These are things that have stimulated what I'm about to show you, the initiatives that are underway, but also form some constraints, if you like, some of the framework within which archives are produced currently. There's the National Planning Policy Framework, which was developed out of PPS 5 and preceded by PPG 16. PPS 5 is probably the best formulation in terms of archive production, but we managed to, even in the NPPF, to get some reference to the production of archives and the necessity for putting them in publicly accessible repository. There's been concern for many years, as I'm sure you all know, about the capacity of museums to continue to collect archive material from archaeology projects, and a number of surveys, which I'll talk briefly about shortly, show just how many of those museums have ceased to collect and how many are about to cease to collect because they've just run out of space. There's an increased quantity of digital output, and this is poorly managed in general. Not everything that we produce as digital material goes into a digital archive, and there has to be some way of addressing that. And then there is the Mendoza review, which is where I'm going to start. Lord Mendoza's independent, if anything ever is, review of museums in England. It charged Historic England with with a responsibility to address issues around museum capacity and the long-term sustainability, as it says there, of the archaeological archives generated by developer-funded excavations. And in response, Historic England produced an action plan, which DCMS endorsed, and the minister at the time, obviously there's been several since, has agreed should form the basis of Historic England's response to that review. And that's where you can find it, on the Historic England website. Good luck working your way through that. There's the blurb there that explains what it is and what we're intending to do. The recommendations that we produced are, I've sort of pulled out the ones that are relevant here to show you what I'm going to be talking about. We're initiating a feasibility study into the viability of establishing, of resolving the sustainability issue of trying to address the issue of a shortage of storage space. It's now an options appraisal. We are hoping, we're working on ways in which to sort of make more consistent the ways in which museums charge for the deposition and curation of archaeological archives. We want to improve the sustainability of archaeological archives, ensure that what's in them is actually what it's best to curate. And we want to address the issue of digital material and recognise that museums really don't have the capability properly to curate digital material in the way that a trusted digital repository such as the Archaeology Data Service does. So if we look at those in turn, this is the draft version of the first version of the report that that consultants appointed by the Arts Council for England and Historic England, and funded largely by the Arts Council, they produced an options appraisal for sustainable archaeological archives, looking into the background in the crisis, if you want to call it that, in museum storage, and producing a set of options for us to take forward. I can't share those with you right now. They're still confidential because we don't want to set off a load of hairs running in all sorts of different directions. The next stage with this is for Arts Council and Historic England to discuss those options and to take forward a plan to determine which option we'd like best and to pursue that. And in advance of that, Historic England are preparing to submit a bid to the next spending review to release some funding. There's no guarantee that any funding will be forthcoming, but that's the plan. The future for Archaeological Archives working party, work packages are, and that group, which is part of Historic England's response to the Mendoza review, is comprised of representatives from all the usual suspects: ALGAO, FAME, CBA, CIfA, the National Trust, Historic England and the Arts Council, and others. So it's a broad representation across the discipline. Universities UK. We've formulated a plan of 12 work packages, and the work programme that we've given ourselves is sort of working through those work packages in different ways. And here's some of our responses. Work Package 1, Professional Standards and Guidance. Historic England is supporting CIfA as it readdresses its current standard and guidance documents and updates them. The Archaeological Archives S&G was recently updated, but not radically. There's a feeling that some of these need to be brought more consistently up to date and actually cross-refer to each other more successfully. So that programme of work is underway with CIfA. Planning for Archives, Opportunities and Omissions was published in 2019. I almost said last year, it's like 2020 never happened. So that you can download. That was a project with ALGAO supported by Historic England. And then there are 2 Historic England research reports which you can get at through our research reports web pages. Number 40 2017 and number 3 2019. One was on deep storage archive facilities and the use of salt mines, etc., and the costs of those relative to alternative forms of curation. And then there was a survey of fees for the transfer of archaeological archives undertaken by Swindon Museum as funded by Historic England. Both of those hopefully will inform discussions about charging structures for the deposition of archaeological archives. Historic England appointed Dig Ventures to produce a toolkit for handling digital material from archaeological investigations, and that too is now available online through the CIfA website. And the Society for Museum Archaeology, independently of and they are actually also on the working party, produced their standard, an updated standard of guidance in the care of archaeological collections, with support from the Arts Council, which addresses to some extent work packages 5 and 7 of the working party's working programme. There is, in that, it says that museums should not collect digital material and should not attempt to curate it. There's a lot more work to do to persuade some curators of that, but that's our starting position at the SMA, and of course it represents joint sector best practice guidance. The issue of transfer of title and ownership is a really difficult one to address. Historic England got advice from a QC looking at current ownership legislation and statutes, and we also worked with a firm of solicitors to produce that document, the deed of transfer, which we're hoping to introduce as a method of initiating the transfer process at the beginning of a project by basically getting landowners to agree in principle to transfer finds and material archive to a curatorial repository as part of the project. It doesn't guarantee that they will, but it's an initial agreement which hopefully will make it more simple to achieve transfer at the end of the project or when archive compilation is complete. I've been trying to work that into a toolkit. Toolkits are the flavour of the month with CIfA and others. I've done quite a few of them now, and I'm sort of trying to put together a toolkit for object ownership, and which combines the advice from the QC and this deed of transfer into a resource that people can tap into and utilise if they need to. I mean, many people already have good processes for transferring title, but not everybody. And speaking of toolkits, there's the the selection toolkit that CIfA produced, the CIfA Archives Group, with again funding from Historic England, which has been out for a while and shall return to later. In terms of museums collecting archives, our starting position there are the 3 consecutive annual surveys of museums collecting archaeology carried out by the SMA, and up to 2018, 2016 to 2018, which showed, I won't go into it in great detail, but you can find the reports. I mean, the headline news, it's not really news, is that about 3/4 of our museums will be out of space within 5 years, and many of them will have to cease collecting archives from that point. Patterns and frequency of archaeological archive use is something that we touched on back in 2012 with Rachel Edwards' report on museums and archaeological archives, and which we're following up now. The SMA has been asked to put together a project, which will be a long-term project, just to see who accesses archives in store in those archaeology collections, and and sort of the groups and the quality of their access. The first step on that is this project that we've commissioned with University Archaeology UK, just to look at how archaeological materials have been accessed in postgraduate research. That's a very quick piece of work which we'll be reporting later this year, and we put that together with what the SMA are hoping to do. We'll get hopefully a good idea of just how useful archive material is. The aim is to be able to justify its collection and curation going forward. And finally, archive retention reviews. This is something I'm not that. I mean, every museum conducts a collections review every so often. There's nothing new about it, but for some reason, some people in Historic England thinks it should be put on our list of things to look at. In relation to that, the SMA has produced their guidance on the rationalisation of museum archaeology collections, which considered just the material already in store, whether or not it's feasible to reduce the quantity of that and create space in stores as a result. I don't want to go into that in too much detail, but the bottom line is that it's a very expensive thing to do and may not always be that productive. Before I move on, I should mention Oasis 5. If you haven't seen that, it has a far more effective link with the archiving process and with museum collections, so that there's a whole archive page of the Oasis form now, which you can update as the project moves through its archiving stages to the deposition of archives in museums, and identifies where the archives can be found, which I think is a huge step forward and will encourage contracting organisations and museums both to engage in project planning and project management, so that everyone knows what's going on and where the material is. So the outcomes of all that, what are they supposed to be? Well, ideally, somewhere to put everything. That's the first thing we want to achieve. It's not, it's easier said than done, but you know, a nice big empty store like this one would go some way towards helping resolve the issue of a huge backlog of undeposited archives with contracting organisations at the moment, and will hopefully create a resource somehow or other. That may be a single building, it may be a network of regional stores, it might just be enhancing the museum framework that's already out there. But either way, we need to resolve this issue. We need assurance that what is being collected is what should be curated. There's been a very inconsistent method of collection. You only have to visit site archives from the 60s or 70s to see that, and we need to be, in order to release any funding at all to support what we hope to achieve in terms of storage or any other aspect of archaeological archiving, collection and curation, we need to persuade people who are not archaeologists that what we do is worthwhile and that what we collect should be preserved. And that is a difficult argument to win every time. So we need to have that assurance. We need to have that own confidence within our profession ourselves that that is what we are doing. And then we need consistent procedures for archaeological archive, including making sure that archive progress is monitorable and can be tracked, that digital data are properly managed, that there is adequate documentation supporting the archive and it is consistent in the way that it's presented and recorded, that we have robust selection procedures for the material archive, that there is consistency in how finds are packed and boxed, that we understand and have a seamless and well recognised procedure for the transfer of ownership, that the costs of archive deposition are understood and are consistent and realistic, and that archives ultimately are accessible and that they represent that resource for other people to access and utilise either for research or just out of interest or enjoyment. As that is the that is essentially the function of the museum to which these archives will go. So what does all that mean in relation to pottery? I suppose that's the next question. I've gone through a few things. I've scooped through this fairly rapidly, relating to the SGRP to attempt to elucidate some of this. If we go back to this, produced in 1991, there are various interesting points to draw from that. Some things don't change, such as blaming English heritage for everything, or as now it is historic England. It's interesting to know that some people claim to dislike using computers. That's probably changed quite a lot. But dissatisfaction with how projects are funded probably hasn't changed very much. It's interesting to see in here the approaches to sampling, if that's the right word. 10% of a large assemblage might be required, whatever that means. Although adequate representation, this is interesting in the light of the paper that we heard yesterday on the A14. It'd be interesting to compare these sort of generalized comments with that far more focused approach. It again goes on to recommend different proportions of sampling for different types of sites, ranging from 25 to 50% of fills on urban sites to 1% of the sample from a kiln site. I'm not sure what the basis for any of that was. Maggie Darling's guidelines for the archiving of Roman pottery, produced in '94 but published about 10 years later, and now available on the SGRP website, has some touches on the same sorts of topics, and quite rightly says all pottery, irrespective of stratification, should be included in the archive unless there's a good case to exclude it. And it sets out what a minimum archive should look like, and says that no group of materials should be excluded on the basis that all interventions have the potential for producing useful evidence. And that, I think that's a good starting point, really, and something that all the pottery study groups could perhaps get together to talk about. Rob's 2011 research strategy didn't look too much into the archiving side of things. There's a call for closer collaboration with museums over selection, and I'll return to that in a minute. It's essentially, as a research framework, having starting from a much broader position, and mentions access to pottery collections. Then there's the combined standard from 2016, which says that 100% of all the pottery found in every contextual unit should be the aim in terms of for analysis, and it should all be collected in accordance with the strategies agreed during project planning. Although there might have to be sampling of things like waste dumps. It ducks the issue of telling people how to create an archive, but it does have this very long list of archive compilation. You can tell that I had a hand in the writing of this document. If we pull out some of the important bits here, we need to ensure that archive selection has been completed in accordance with a selection strategy. It emphasizes the need for a data management plan, and it says that the Digital Archive Index should support a digital archive. From a pottery point of view, the two main things are that digital material and the issue of selection, and the CIfA selection toolkit addresses that issue. I hope some of you have seen that. It includes a template for preparing a selection strategy that covers the three main elements of an archaeological archive: the documentary, digital, and material archives. And you can formulate it. This is my sort of draft formulation of how I would set it up with a material group basis. So you base it on ceramic, and then in pink I've highlighted an amendment to that might have been added by a repository curator, a museum curator, who wants to collect certain parts of an assemblage that may not always have been selected. The important thing here is that the pottery specialist needs to be involved. A selection strategy does not mean that you have to select. You can have a selection strategy that is 100% collection and selection for archive. You just have to have the strategy to justify that approach. And that's why it's important for specialists to be engaged in determining the strategy as part of project planning and thereafter. So if we're to look at a selection strategy and what it should include, it is about the potential for reuse. That goes back to what Maggie Darling wrote in '94. It's about research and analysis for exhibition, education, communication, all those things. And selection should not be determined by storage capacity. Just because there isn't any space to put something doesn't mean that it should not be collected. It just means that there's an issue about finding somewhere to store it. But we cannot let those sorts of issues determine a selection strategy, and we should not do that. This is my sort of summary. What is required for successful archive delivery? I've highlighted in pink there the things that probably relate to specialists. Engagement with the selection strategy. If you're producing digital material, you should have a data management plan. Even if even if you're an independent specialist, you should understand the requirements of the digital material, the aim to add your material to a digital archive, and you should engage with that and ensure that what you are preparing for transfer to the overall project archive actually is usable and accessible. And finally, everyone involved in a project has responsibility towards the archive. That includes pottery specialists as much as anybody else. And I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening, if you still are.